Okay.
Venus.
Yeah, I'm ready. So, sure. So, how would you like to start?
Yeah. So just start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your work, and like what you do. In terms of your philosophical, sort of overall philosophical approach, if that makes sense.
I think so. Yeah. So, hi everybody. My name is Felipe Leon. I am a philosopher who specializes in philosophical methodology, especially the epistemology of modality and thought experiments, but also, of course, philosophy of religion. My philosophical background is that I got a PhD in philosophy at UC Riverside. And currently I'm working on issues in the epistemology of modality, but of course, again, issues in philosophy of religion. My basic philosophical approach in terms of methodology is sort of a mix of sort of classical armchair methods, that is, thought experiments, conceptual analysis, evaluating and constructing, deductive and inductive arguments, but also increasingly, I am inclined towards very much empirically informed philosophy, especially right now, philosophy of physics. Um, uh, we could talk about that later, but I think that issues in philosophy of physics have a huge bearing on issues in philosophy of religion. And so if you read my work, you'll see me on a trajectory towards how issues in philosophy of physics can be brought to bear in issues in philosophy of religion.
All right. So that's good. So we're gonna get to our questions.
Okay.
We're gonna try to ask a little bit because there are several questions from different users. So we're gonna start by going in line. So what do you think of the many kinds of correspondence? It is unintuitive to just say there's one way different propositions correspond to reality. Criticism of correspondence theory. Do you think that it is valid? So yeah.
Yeah, so this gets into sort of the metaphysics of truth. It's not one of my areas of focus. I'm inclined towards some sort of correspondence theory of truth. But I'm fine with some kind of minimalist account where you say that P is true just reduces to P, where P is some declarative sentence. Like it's raining. The statement "it's raining" is true, right? What does that mean? Well, the statement matches the world in some way, right? The relevant portion of the world is such that it's raining. But so I don't really have a dog in that hunt about correspondence. One of my friends, Josh Rasmussen, wrote a book on the correspondence theory of truth with Oxford that's very interesting. But I myself don't really have a dog in that hunt. There are some people bring up arguments that to the effect that the correspondence theory of truth is somehow better accounted for in a theistic view of the world than not. I myself can't. I myself struggle to see how that could be true. No pun intended. But yeah. So in short, I'm not really. That's not one of my areas of specialization. But I'm inclined towards something like a correspondence theory of truth. There's going to be arguments for and against that account till the cows come home. And because that's true, I'm not inclined to devote too much of my time to that debate unless someone can show me how that has a bearing on issues in modal epistemology or philosophy of religion.
Okay. So I'm gonna host the rest of the AMA. I just had to get something fixed.
Sure.
So I'm thinking we'll go for 60 minutes, and then after that we'll do the promotion stuff where you'll just share where people can find your work, if you have a website or other things like that. Does
Sure.
that sound fine with you? Cool.
Yeah, sounds great.
So starting with, so Alex Stresser asked like a set of questions. We'll go through them, and if there's like one that you either don't find particularly interesting or outside your field or something like that, we can just skip it. Like there's like a lot of questions. And his first one is, what's your favorite, most intriguing argument for God's existence, if any?
Good question. I think that it's hard to settle on one. I mean, uh, I'd have to say the cosmological argument, in its various guises, has consumed a lot of my focus over the last couple of decades. I just find it just intrinsically fascinating and sublime to talk about. Can we figure out the fundamental cause or explanation or source or ground of the universe? Some of these are better than others, but I think that Josh Rasmussen has the best version of the cosmological argument, or family of versions of the cosmological argument. His one that he defended not so long ago in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, where he adds a normally operator to the explanatory premise, to the principle of sufficient reason of a certain sort. Normally things with beginnings have causes or explanations. And it's possible that, and then he modalizes the premise that the universe had a beginning. It's possible that it did. There's a possible world at which it did. And then that plus a few other premises can get you that there's a possible world in which God causes the universe. And then from axiom S5 of S5 modal logic, you get, since the cause must be a necessary being, and what's necessary doesn't vary from world to world, God must exist in the actual world. I think that's a pretty cool argument. So I don't ultimately find it persuasive, but I think that kind of argument is pretty cool. He has a recent book with Alexander Pruss on necessary being and necessary beings, where he goes into that argument in detail. I think it's fascinating. It's definitely worth engaging and answering, but I don't find it ultimately persuasive. I give some of my reasons for thinking not in my dialogue book with Josh Rasmussen. The book's called "Is God the Best Explanation of Things?" A dialogue, which came out at the end of 2019. Other than that, I used to think the fine-tuning argument was really good and interesting. It sort of kept me agnostic. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty good explanation of things. Why is this universe sort of fine-tuned for life so that life could evolve within it? But recently, I'm just no longer persuaded by that. I tend to think that there's other independent grounds for thinking that there are many universes. A lot of that stem from the best explanation of interference and entanglement phenomena in quantum mechanics push me towards an Everettian many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics as the abductively best explanation of quantum phenomena. And right out of that falls out a many worlds interpretation of the universe. So you have independent empirical evidence for many worlds. And you're going to get at least one kind of multiverse from that. And some people argue from that, well, yeah, there's many many worlds, and so fine tuning seems less problematic on that view. I'm also working on a paper right now that is I've been recently intrigued by Spinoza's work on the principle of sufficient reason. One of the classical Continental rationalists. And he gives an intriguing sort of negative version of the principle of sufficient reason, which says, the standard version that we're familiar with from Leibniz, by the way, principle of sufficient reason goes back to the pre-Socratic philosophers and not just to the Continental rationalists. But, the standard version is that, everything needs an explanation for why it exists or occurs, whether in terms of its own nature or in terms of something else. But Spinoza goes further and says, for anything that doesn't exist or occur or obtain, there has to be an explanation for why it doesn't exist or occur or obtain. So given that negative version, which I'm trying to motivate in current research, it'd be weird if certain things didn't exist. And if it's weird that everything doesn't exist in some region of the multiverse or other, without a sufficient reason, the default position is that everything exists in some region of the multiverse or other. And if that's true, then it'd be surprising. It's not surprising at all that our universe exists. More recently, I think I'd be inclined to say that something like the argument from religious experience is the most interesting. I think at the end of the day, it still gets a point or two. People have profound religious experiences. I've had profound religious experiences back in my religious days, in what seems kind of like another life now. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, those sorts of indications only provide sort of prima facie pro tanto evidence that's overturned by other evidence and sort of ideological naturalistic explanations for the origin of religious experience.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, I'll get back to Alex. Just going to take other people's questions, so it'll be fair. Haiku asks, in your blog post, why abstract objects pose a nasty problem for theists, you tried arguing for atheism with the existence of abstract objects. Do you think there are better reasons to be Platonist about abstract objects than to be a theist? And what sort of escape could a theist have from this objection?
Good question. I should shameless promotion. I have a chapter in a book edited by Graham Oppie and Joseph Koterski called A Priori Atheism. And I go through arguments for a priori knowledge and abstract objects for the existence of the God of theism. And I explain, I think the original draft was like 50 pages. So I go through all those main arguments for and against and why I'm not persuaded. So I'd recommend people who are interested in that to look at that. I think I have it on my Phil papers, my Phil people and my academia.edu page, and also at my my Google website. If you just go Felipe Leon philosophy or something. And also in the book with Josh, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? Lately, I don't know if I'm a Platonist anymore. I think due to some recent readings and thinking about it, I tend to think that there are properties. I don't know if they're abstract objects. I'm not sure if there are repeatable objects in the classical sense. Redness, all these different tokens of redness in different particular objects that we see around us, all participate in the form of redness, this abstract universal, although that may be true. But now I tend to think that the arguments, when you really dig into the details of the arguments for and against Platonism about abstract objects, really make it not as plausible as you would have thought from standard arguments for abstract objects. But having said that, I still think that there are properties, and properties are sort of the elements of being, and that object, there are different tokens of red objects in a hat, and in a Trump hat, and in the flag, and so forth. but they just stand in these brute relations of absolute or relative similarity. And there's sort of collections of tropes or particular instances. And I tend to think, at least, you can never be that, you can never have that high of a credence in these really abstruse debates about abstract objects. But I tend to think, tentatively now, that the universe is made out of properties, and that from properties you get the modal space or the space of possibilities, and from that you get, at some point you get the world of concrete objects. I don't know, who knows, maybe you get quantum loops or causal sets, and from that, and we don't have a widely accepted theory of quantum gravity yet, but maybe from that you get the space-time manifold, and from that you get everything else, subatomic particles, and on up to macroscopic objects. But I think at the foundation you're going to get these fundamental properties, which are concrete tokens. Again, I don't know, it sort of depends on the day of the week whether I accept that sort of a view, but I go into detail on for why I think abstract objects are a problem for theism in that chapter in the Oppie Kotersky book and in the debate with Josh. But I mean, a couple of the main reasons why I'm persuaded that they're a problem for theism, if there are conditional and there being abstract objects, is that God is built out of abstract objects. If there are abstract objects, right, and they explain and ground the properties that we see, the concrete token properties we see, well, God has concrete tokens of properties. He has property instances or tropes. The property of being divine, the property of being a person, the property of being all-knowing, of being all-powerful, being morally perfect, and so forth. All those are properties. And so for God to create properties, he already has to have properties to make new ones. And so you get this bootstrapping problem. But if God's built out of these if he has these metaphysical parts, to quote another philosopher, then it looks like properties are more fundamental than God. Sort of at the foundation of reality, at the bedrock, you have abstract objects, either abstract objects like Platonic forms, or you have Aristotelian immanent universals, or you have tropes that stand in relations of exact similarity or something, or relative similarity. And God's built out of those, along with everything else in modal space. And so God just doesn't seem like a candidate for being fundamental. Furthermore, if God were the ground of abstract objects, a standard view of that is what's called Theistic Conceptualism, sort of a Neoplatonic view that sort of, Alvin Plantinga and others have endorsed and somewhat defended by saying, God's, abstract objects are divine concepts, propositions are divine thoughts, possible worlds are maximal consistent sets of divine propositions, which are divine thoughts, and so forth. If that view were true, the problem is, there's several problems with that view, but one of the most glaring one is if propositions were divine thoughts, they'd be concrete particulars and therefore not repeatable entities. And so he could not, just logically, conceptually could not. His mind could not provide the foundation for universals such as propositions, sets, possible worlds, and so forth, properties. Because then, right, those things are supposed to be universals, and God's thoughts are particulars. And so that's a problem. But if you, a good point of entry into this literature is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry by Matthew Davidson called God and Other Abstract Objects. He is a theist, by the way. And he has a paper in Phil Studies, I think, called The Demonstration Against Theistic Activism, that gives this sort of a problem. But I think that what's a way out? I think there's plenty of ways out for a theist. You could just be a nominalist. There are no abstract objects. William Lane Craig takes this approach in his book God Over All, and then his larger massive book of which God Overall is just a digest of those arguments. Okay, what is that book? Does anyone know? It's been several years since I read it. I read it when it came out, but I've forgotten it.
Wait, which one?
Actually, let me just bring it up. Let's see. So the one that everyone's read is called God Overall, where William Lane Craig agrees with me that if abstract objects exist, then atheism is true, because then there's more fundamental beings, or beings that God didn't create, abstract objects, namely. And so if Platonism about abstract objects is true, then atheism is true, or at least classical theism is false. Because according to classical theism, they accept this doctrine called the, what is it? The aseity doctrine. What's the other half? I should have eaten before I came on. But it's like the something aseity doctrine, which basically says that everything, God doesn't depend on anything for its existence, and everything else besides God depends upon God for its existence. I think it's a aseity sovereignty doctrine. But anyway, if abstract objects exist as Platonic entities, then they do not depend on God for their existence, and God did not create them. And so he wrote this book, God Overall, to argue against Platonism about abstract objects, as well as theistic conceptualism, the kind of view that Alvin Plantinga and others have defended, as well as variations on those sorts of views. And he says, no, they're all wrong. And he argues for nominalism. There are no abstract objects. So you could easily take, the theist could easily get out of this by just rejecting the existence of abstract objects. Of course, a lot of theists don't like that, because a lot of theists want to use abstract objects as evidence for God. And if William Lane Craig is right, they're going to have to throw that out.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
So Real Atheology asks, with the recent passing of Quentin Smith, it seems that the best atheist philosophers, such as Saki, Smith, are all dead. How do you think the state of atheism is currently in the analytical philosophy of religion today?
Good question. I think it's still in pretty good shape. There's a lot of people coming up the ranks who are interested in it, but I think let me say a couple things about this. It's really hard for an atheist to be in philosophy of religion, because the way that academic philosophy works is academic philosophy is a professionalized discipline now. And so, you go into graduate school, you start working on, right out of the gate, start working on publications, start writing papers that your professors really like, and then polishing them and starting to publish them, and then have a couple of publications by the time you're out, so you get tenured. And then to get tenured, you just stay narrowly focused on this very narrow topic or two in your area of specialization. And because that's true, nobody really has time to write papers if they want to be employed as a philosopher. They don't have time to write papers on philosophy of religion if they're not a theist, typically. Furthermore, a lot of departments really don't want to hire you if your focus is area of philosophy of religion. Most philosophers just don't find theism plausible. And so they're like, why am I going to argue about the existence of witches, basically? So there's just not a lot of motivation for it. So the first point is just sort of contemporary academic philosophy is structured due to its professionalization to discourage non-Christians to go in it. Christians can find jobs. There's always a few philosophy of religion jobs out there. Usually what Christian philosophers of religion do is they start out reading a lot of apologetics from people like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga and so forth, and they get really excited about, hey, there's this rigorous academic discipline that is that can be used to defend their religious beliefs. This is the track I took. I did this when I was a Christian and thought I was going to be, a light in the world by being a tenured professor, philosophy professor, and teach classes in philosophy of religion, but also, be a witness on the campus as just being a virtuous person that happens to be a Christian, that's a philosopher or something like that. That's kind of how Christian philosophers are sort of groomed, to use a sort of pejorative word. Places like Biola or Talbot Theological Seminary in La Mirada, California, Calvin College in what's that, Michigan, and Notre Dame in Indiana. They all have this kind of program. And so, I went to Biola went to Talbot at La Mirada studying under J.P. Moreland and others, Doug Guyvet and others there. Great guys, funny people. But, got disillusioned at some point halfway through my PhD program at UC Riverside. But I think that, so they have a strong incentive and they have a nice sort of on-ramp into academic philosophy and into philosophy of religion. And they have these sort of lights, so to speak, to guide them. People like Alvin Plantinga, who's kind of emeritus now, and up-and-comers who followed his path to as leading figures in philosophy of religion. They have journals like the Faith and Philosophy, Philosophia Christi, journals that are the official journals of the Society of Christian Philosophers and the Evangelical Philosophical Society in particular. And so they have a nice incentive structure, and a lot of them go into secular colleges and universities to teach, but a lot of them go into Christian colleges as well, as at least fallback places. But there's not the same incentive structure for non-theists. And so that's problematic. So that's the first thing I'd say about that. But still, there are people coming down the pipeline and out there that are doing really good work. The second thing I want to say is, I think we're sort of we're in a bad place in philosophy of religion right now. There's this old, tired debate that started, in the Middle Ages, basically, with this debate between theism and naturalism, right? Sort of theists versus atheists. I think that's just a big mistake. I think it's a historical accident that this happened. I think that is just such a narrow way of approaching philosophy of religion. It's not like philosophy of religion is the philosophy of Christian theism or something like that, let alone the philosophy of theism or the philosophy of atheism. Philosophy of religion is about religion, full stop. Eastern religions, Western religions, non-standard religions. And more broadly, it's really about evaluating comprehensive worldviews, right? That's what people really care about. What's the ultimate foundation of reality, right? And that's kind of what people that are interested in this theism-atheism debate are interested in. And there's such a huge, potentially infinite variety of hypotheses about the ultimate ground of reality besides, Christian theism and really narrow atheism like, physicalism or something. Everything's composed of something described in the language of physics or something like that. There's a huge variety of views, and it's just, it's sort of like this. Suppose, here's sort of like a simplistic view of how we came up with our theory about the shape of the moon, right? So maybe in the past we thought it was a disk based on our observations, and then we had evidence that it was a sphere, and then more data came in and we said, oh, it's sort of an ovoid shape. And then later on, we're like, well, it's an oblate spheroid. And our hypotheses got more and more granular and fine-grained with more and more data, right? And so philosophy of religion should look like this about our theories about the shape of the moon. It should be, there's a huge variety of data that has a bearing on our comprehensive worldviews, right? So I give a list of 100 on my blog, Ex-Apologist, 100 or so arguments for atheism. A lot of these I need to sort of flesh out, but in due course. But these are, I try to bring all these arguments in as data points to start shaping our views of comprehensive reality. And I don't think it's going to end with either theism or, this physicalist view. It's going to be somewhere in between. And so you got to look at these sorts of arguments, just bring every piece of data that you have to bear on your comprehensive hypothesis of ultimate reality, and just start from a position of agnosticism. Like, I don't know, this is beyond, it's not a Morean fact. It's not a fact that's sort of obvious and resists skeptical doubts. It's not a priori. It's not common sense. And so let's just start with agnosticism. I don't know what the ground of ultimate reality is, or the ultimate source or explanation. So let me just start with agnosticism and then look around at the data and then start formulating hypotheses. And then once you have a bunch of hypotheses out there, you test them for internal coherence and so forth. And then you see, in terms of theoretical virtues, which theory best explains the data in terms of simplicity, explanatory scope, conservatism, that is fit with other data, and so forth. And so based on a sort of theoretical cost-benefit analysis, you start narrowing down plausible hypotheses. If we just do this thing of theism versus atheism, I think we're just really not going to make a lot of progress. I think we just have to just put all these different hypotheses out there and see which one does it the best. Again, another shameless plug, in my book with Josh Rasmussen, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? I give about a dozen arguments, which I take as data points for constructing a comprehensive theory, and I don't end up with classical theism or physicalism. I end up with something in the middle. And what I think is cool about that is it's conciliatory. It's like, here's a view that both theists and atheists can get behind, right? You have a picture of the world, that allows for the possibility of objective moral value, objective purpose and meaning, the existence of phenomenal states or conscious states, right? All of that. And maybe the universe could be an object of worship. And it's something that both a theist and an atheist can accept. And so my goal ultimately is just to get this polarizing element out of philosophy of religion that sort of prevents us from looking at the evidence squarely. I think that sort of like strict physicalism and classical theism are, what the philosopher of science Imre Lakatos would call degenerative research programs. They don't, they're not providing sort of fruitful research programs that are explaining and predicting new phenomena. They're really generating auxiliary hypotheses, sort of a belt of auxiliary hypotheses whose only function is to save their core theory from refutation. And so I think they're both sort of degenerative research programs. And hopefully something like I'm proposing is a successful, productive, progressive research program. Ultimately, I don't care, though. I'm not interested in picking a side and fighting for it. I'm glad to abandon the view I have for a new one, because that's progress, right? So that's the second thing I have to say. I think this old theism-atheism debate is just really stale and counterproductive, and it should look more like our theories of the shape of the moon than, mounting a set of deductive arguments on each side and an infinite iteration of revision and counterexample and revision and counterexample kind of thing. I think the history of philosophy of religion has shown that there is some good to that, but it's limited. So those are the two or three main things I have to say about that. Good question.
No, thank you. Well, all the credit for a question goes to Relay Theology. I was thanking for the answer. So Benna asks, what are your thoughts on presuppositional apologetics?
I'm not a big fan. I would recommend reading a paper by Gene Whitmer, a philosopher. Where is he? At like Florida State University, but his name's Gene Whitmer, Witmer. And if you Google, yeah, he's at the University of Florida. If you Google Gene Whitmer presuppositional apologetics, you'll find a document he has on presuppositionalism that I think is probably the best thing I've read on it, on that stuff. He kind of really gets to the root of it. Now, there is a more sophisticated kind of presuppositional apologetics, which is, let's face it, Alvin Plantinga's Reformed epistemology, which says that belief in God is properly basic, which he developed almost his whole career, and came to mature form in terms of this proper functionalist, externalist account of epistemic warrant. That account is way more interesting and plausible. So I actually think he's right that some kind of proper functionalism is correct. Full disclosure, I went to UC Riverside, and my dissertation advisor was Peter J. Graham, who's an atheist but also a proper functionalist about epistemic warrant for perception, for example. But he gives a naturalistic evolutionary account. So I think that Alvin Plantinga's sort of proper functionalism is kind of at least a cousin of presuppositional apologetics. And as a Dutch Reformed Calvinist kind of person, Alvin Plantinga was influenced by that kind of stuff. And you can see his view as sort of like, what's the most plausible way I can spell out this kind of thing? This sort of thing that, it's not quite a transcendental argument, but he says, well, I'm a proper functionalist about warrant. That is, beliefs produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties like perception, memory, and so forth, reason, functioning in epistemically congenial environments or congenial epistemic environments, whose design plan is aimed at truth, and who is successful at that, right? The reliability is above 1/2. So he gives this account, and then he says, beliefs formed according to this sort of design plan, when those beliefs are believed with, the degree of warrant they have is directly proportional to the firmness of the belief. So properly functioning faculties plus high degrees of belief equals high degrees of warrant. Properly functioning faculties produce a belief with low degree of firmness equals low degree of warrant. So that's his account. I think it's subject to devastating counterexamples. I think probably the most powerful one is that it makes his views sort of self-referentially incoherent, because then God has faculties and they're supposed to function properly, but they have no design plan, let alone a design plan aimed at truth, in which case none of God's beliefs have warrant. So if none of God's beliefs have warrant, we shouldn't have any reason to think that if God designed us, he designed us competently to produce true beliefs. So I think that ultimately Plantinga's proper functionalist account of warrant will entail that none of our beliefs have warrant, including God's beliefs. So I think that's a problem. On my blog, I have a post called "What's Wrong with Plantinga's Proper Functionalism," where I go through a bunch of I spell out his view and give links to problems with it that I'd recommend looking at. But I think that kind of sort of offshoot of presuppositionalism is the best sort of view to look at. But ultimately, I don't think it's successful.
Okay. Thank you for the answer.
Sure.
Going back to Alex, his second question was, area of philosophy that you find the most enjoyable to read and why?
Good question. I mentioned this at the beginning, so I should say a little bit more about it. Recently, my most favorite branch of philosophy to read in is philosophy of physics. And it started with reading James Ladyman and Don Ross et al.'s book, Everything Must Go, which argues that I think they overreach in their book, and the book is very polemical, but they say that, look, at some point, philosophy got off the rails. It's no longer properly informed by contemporary physics. A lot of debates in philosophy, like mereological composition and so forth, when did two or more things make a new thing? The metaphysics of composition and other debates depend on something like classical Newtonian physics, which is just a false theory of physics. Causation doesn't occur largely by what they call microbangings, where particles collide and so forth. There aren't any particles, as a matter of fact, according to our best physics. Relativistic quantum field theory says that there are these relativistic quantum fields, and that particles are just excitations of this field, right? And so there really aren't any particles. There's these fields, and so the idea of locality, that causal events occur, causal processes have to happen with things that are spatiotemporally contiguous with other things, is false, right? We've proven with the Bell inequality theorems that quantum entanglement, particles can affect each other across vast regions of the universe simultaneously, faster than the speed of light. And so quantum non-locality cast doubt on our theories about what's required for causation. Some people argue that our best theories of physics don't even require causation. And so causation is superfluous. And so after reading that book and sort of related work to that kind of project towards a sort of physics-guided metaphysics, I think I found it really fruitful to look at debates in philosophy of physics to inform philosophy and our general ontology of what sorts of things exist. I found that the most fruitful. I'll give a couple examples. So one I just gave, things like quantum non-locality, and there aren't any particles really, or if there are, they emerge from fields, which is more basic. Sort of the sexiest topic, I think, right now is one that's being pursued by people like David Albert and Alyssa Ney, this sort of wave function realism, which says that it may be that our best account of what's going on in quantum mechanics is that there's this massively higher dimensional configuration space that has 3 to the n dimensions, where 3 is the degrees of freedom of, up, down, left, right, forward, back, times the number of particles in the universe, right? So 3 times 3 to the n dimensions. So since there's, I don't know, how many particles are there? 10 to the 80th? So 3 times 10 to the 80th dimensions. So there's massively higher dimensional configuration space, which is the ground of quantum phenomena. And the worry is sort of the explanation of quantum phenomena in terms of this massively higher dimensional jiggling configuration space. We so far have been unsuccessful in recovering the ordinary dimensions, 3 dimensions of ordinary experience from them. And if that's right, then some wave function realists think that, configuration space realists, so to speak, think that there's pressure to say that the world of experience is a mirage or illusion. And of course, if that is true, talk about a cool idea and a sort of sublime idea. It's of course going to cause problems for theism, because then ordinary sense experience is massively unreliable, and it's of course going to call into question all sorts of common sense claims that we take to know, like, oh, these are hands. If you have hands and you hold them in front of your face, well, there's not really hands. Those are projections down from a higher dimensional configuration space that look like hands, and so forth. Another sort of sexy topic in philosophy of physics is Everettian many worlds interpretations of quantum mechanics, which is kind of, I think, the mainstream view in philosophy of physics, which again entails that there are many universes, but a certain sort of many worlds. Like, so for each moment, we're constantly branching Hydra-like into parallel universes where, think about the moment you were born. Ever since that moment, you've been constantly branching, right? So it's sort of like trillions and trillions of branches of you, all with the same causal origin. And then if this is true, of course, that's going to have huge implications for philosophy of religion. For example, if you suppose on theism that, God exists and you have a soul, this sort of Cartesian ego that's conjoined to your body, does your Cartesian ego branch with the wave function branching? Then which one is you? Which branch is you? If you're in every branch, then you're going to have this weird branching Cartesian ego. Some of them are going to go to heaven and some go to hell. So part of your branches will be in heaven, some will be in hell. If your soul only goes with one branch, then you're going to have radical skepticism about the existence of other minds, because probably most of the other people around you are sort of automata with no souls inside that act like they do, right? Another problem is going to be that Everettian quantum mechanics is deterministic, and so you don't have libertarian free will. Another problem is for the incarnation, you're going to have many Christs and many branches of the wave function. Some of them, he dies for us, apparently, so he's going to have trillions and trillions of crucifixions. Which Jesus are we going to meet in heaven? So it looks like just quantum mechanics all by itself, sort of Everettian standard many worlds interpretation quantum mechanics, seems almost flatly inconsistent with classical Christian theism. So I think that this is where the gold is right now for digging into, if you're interested in these debates about Christian theism or something in particular, that's where to dig, I think, is the philosophy of physics literature, and then let upcoming philosophers of religion focus on that stuff.
Okay, thank you. So a person wanted to ask you a question via audio. Is that audio?
Sure.
Okay.
Dog,
just...
Yeah, one second. Yeah, so Felipe Leon, there's someone named Dawkins. He's a very, let's just say, famous, or maybe infamous would be the appropriate term, on Discord. He's a Christian apologist, and he'd like to ask you some questions. So if at any point you want to move on to some other topic, just let us know. All right,
Sure.
Darth, take it away. Yeah, okay.
Okay. I wasn't here at the beginning. How would you prefer that I address you?
However you want. Felipe is fine.
Okay. All right. Felipe, do you hold to the position that God does not exist, and that God would be what is ultimate, fundamental, and the source of all possibility?
No, I wouldn't deny that. If all you mean by God is the ultimate source of fundamental reality, then no, I don't deny that.
Do you believe that that is the case?
Do I believe that there's like a single source of fundamental reality? There's
No.
a
Do you believe what is ultimate and fundamental, the source of all possibility, is a mind and a creator that is the source of all temporality?
Oh, I'm agnostic about that. I think it's sort of too early in the game in philosophy of religion to know that. I think it's definitely a live hypothesis worthy of exploration.
Okay. So you don't believe that it's necessary to reference God as the necessary precondition of all facts?
No, at least I haven't
Okay.
seen why
Okay.
yet. Yeah.
Okay. So if there are one or more facts that don't necessitate referencing God as the necessary precondition, can God logically coexist in such a world?
Could God logically coexist in a world in which what? I'm not sure I'm holding it all together.
Can
Can you?
God logically coexist in a world where there are one or more temporal facts that don't necessitate deriving from him?
Oh, yeah. Once you get there, I might be off ship. I don't think that God can cause anything. I don't think
But
that he can cause abstract objects, and I don't think he can
that's not my
cause
question.
concrete objects.
That's not my question. Okay.
Oh, okay.
My question is, if you believe that there are one or more facts that don't necessitate referencing the necessity of God, in that the temporal facts stand in causal relations to God as the ultimate, okay? You believe that such facts exist that don't stand in causal relations to God?
Are there facts that exist that don't stand in causal relations to God?
Or
Uh,
necessitate referencing God?
um, huh. That's kind of a complicated thought, but I probably have to think about it more. I think it'd be cool if we wrote this out so I could sort of sit there and sort of reflect on it. But I would say, yeah, there could
I can
exist
I can
facts.
rephrase the question for you. Do you believe that it is necessary to reference God as the necessary precondition of all temporal facts?
Um, Prima facie, no.
Okay, well then
Do you mean
God
by
could not
God?
logically coexist in such a world, right?
God couldn't exist in worlds where there are facts distinct from him, right? Is that the idea?
I'm asking you, can God coexist in a world where he is defined as the necessary precondition of all facts? Can God logically coexist in a world where there are one or more facts that do not necessitate referencing him or standing in causal relations with him?
Oh, I see. Holding fixed your definition of God, could I then do that? Uh, Man, yeah, sort of, sort of like a lot to hold in my head, but I think I know where you're going with this. And say, holding fixed a conception of God as some sort of ontological ground of reality. Could there then be facts that don't depend on him
Can
and some?
can God coexist when he's defined as the creator of all facts that are not himself? Can he coexist with facts that don't derive and depend upon him?
Yeah. So you're talking about a God. So yeah, maybe I might go back on this because now I'm starting to think about if there's a being that's a God that is the cause of everything else. I think that very idea of God as the cause of everything else is incoherent.
So you believe that, so is it your position that nothing is ultimate and fundamental, the source of all possibility?
I'm actually agnostic about that. Before, a couple of years ago, I would have said there is, but now there's a debate in metaphysics of fundamentality where, the standard view, even people, leading people in sort of metaphysics like Jonathan Schaffer, who argues for like a priority monism, where the whole universe is ontologically prior to any
Um,
other substances. So he's sort of like there's this sort of like we take ultimate reality to be sort of like a foundation, and everything is built on the foundation, sort of like foundationalism in epistemology. And now there's a debate. Oh yeah, let me just finish this and then we'll go. But now there's a debate with people like Ricky Bliss and others in the grounding literature, which are saying there's room for infinite descending ground. And in particular, she's arguing that there's epistemic space for the universe as sort of like a coherentist web rather than a foundation of interdependent support. So now I'm sort of like, I have to sort of spend a couple years, at least a year, exploring that debate before I can say that there's something fundamental in this sort of metaphysical foundationalist event. But at least I can do this, right, to continue the conversation, conditional upon sort of a foundationalist metaphysics. I don't think that God could play the role of that as creator of other facts, because I think that kind of creation, if it involves creation ex nihilo, is metaphysically impossible.
Okay. Do you believe that anything is impossible?
Yes.
Okay. And what is it that ultimately and fundamentally in reality that instantiates that?
So I guess what instantiates...
And the reason why I ask that, because it's going to be related to my question about your atheism. So what is it that is fundamental and ultimate?
I should say I'm not an atheist in the broad sense. I'm an agnostic. So I'm sort of like, I don't know, these large-scale hypotheses are tricky. Maybe something like Protestant evangelical Christianity, I think.
No, I'm still waiting for an answer to my question, and I'm truly not trying to be rude. Okay, what I asked you was, I want to know is, in your view, what is it that is ultimate and fundamental that institutes and secures what's possible and impossible?
Oh, I think the data's still out on that. I'm kind of agnostic. It's such a deep issue. All
right. So you don't know then?
Yeah, I don't know.
Since you don't know what is ultimate and fundamental, then on what rational grounds can you say anything is impossible, including God?
Oh, sure. I think that we can say that some things. I think it takes sort of a defeasible prima facie kind of view to claims about possibility and necessity. So you could say, well, on the face of it, what makes anything possible?
No, I said, what makes anything impossible in your worldview?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't, to the extent that I have a worldview, I guess I would say something like preclusion relations. So, for example, suppose you have...
No, I mean, what is it that is fundamental and ultimate that dictates all possibility and impossibility? What then makes anything and everything impossible?
I guess going back, so this is sort of a tentative view, but suppose I have sort of like a trope ontology, or something like, just fundamentally, the most fundamental elements of being are properties, where properties are just collections of things.
Do you know that? Do you know that?
No, this is tentative.
Okay, well, I'm asking you, do you know what is ultimate and fundamental that institutes and secures what is possible and impossible? Do you know what that is?
Well, that's what I'm telling you. I'm giving you a tentative framework. I mean, if you're talking about, do I know for certain? I don't.
No, I'm not asking you for a certainty. I'm saying, do you know at all? I'm not asking a question of to what a degree of confidence. Do you know what is fundamentally ultimate, instituting and dictating what's possible and impossible?
Well, I don't think anybody knows that.
Well, if you don't know that, on what grounds do you say that God does not exist or cannot exist?
I don't. Any God?
Well, you don't have a paper. You don't have a paper that I just looked at that had over 100 reasons for atheism?
Yes.
Okay, so do you offer reasonings why God cannot exist? I mean, I heard you earlier talking about if abstract objects exist, this would mean that God cannot exist. But you just told me you have no idea what is ultimate and fundamental dictating what's possible and impossible. So if you don't know what's impossible, how can you assert what is, can be, or cannot be?
Well, you can, because you could just say, well, I don't know it, but I have prima facie justification for it.
Okay, so when you say prima facie justification, but that's not grounding in what ultimately makes it that way. So it's not necessarily true, is it?
I think we're sort of conflating epistemology and metaphysics. I mean, you could have prima facie justification for metaphysical modality. So you could have prima facie, this is possible, or prima facie, that's impossible, right? And prima facie, that's necessary.
But does that mean does that mean that it could be false?
Yeah, it could be false. Like I could say
Okay.
this is a hand, and that could be false because
Okay.
I could be a computer simulation.
So
but for all that, I have prima facie justification.
So in your worldview, ultimate reality is shrouded in mystery. Is that your position?
Well, in my view, ultimate reality, we have prima facie justification. So we
what is it? What is ultimate in reality then, instituting possibility and impossibility then? What is it?
Oh, sure. Well, you have the elements of being, you have properties and qualities. And they
I want to know.
I'm trying to give you an answer. So from these qualities, they can stand in intrinsic relations of inclusion and preclusion and compatibility. And that would be on this hypothesis, the ground of possibility, necessity, and impossibility. So for example, you have the property of being, suppose we're talking about two-dimensional closed plane figures like triangles and circles and squares. And you say, is it possible for there to be a round square, right? A two-dimensional closed plane figure that both does and doesn't have corners, right? At the same time, in the same respect, in the same inertial frame or something. And you'd say, no, prima facie you can't, because the properties of one preclude the properties of the other. And so that would generate prima facie claim that that's impossible, right? And so the ultimate foundation of modality would be sort of intrinsic relations between qualities or properties. Same thing for logic. So for example, you could say for logic, same thing. What's the ground for logical truths? It's inclusion relations between qualities. So if something is red, then it's colored, right? What grounds that logical truth? Well, the property of being colored is included in the property of being red, and so that would be the ground of entailment. So you can get, from a distribution of qualities, you can get modality, and you can get logic, and so forth.
Unfortunately, the problem is you just told me, and everyone here, you don't know what's ultimate and fundamental dictating what's possible and impossible. So whatever you say is possible, I mean, then it can't be impossible. But you don't know what's ultimate dictating what's possible and impossible, do you?
Well, I'm saying I'm prima facie justified.
Okay, when you say that prima facie justified, could you be wrong about that?
Well, yeah, insofar as I could be
so
wrong
it's
that
not.
I'm holding hands in front of my face, then yeah, I'm prima facie justified in believing I have two hands in front of my eyes. So I have sort of defeasible burden shifting evidence that I do. And you might even say I'm licensed to say that I know that. But suppose it turns out, I'm in the Matrix, or I'm hallucinating. You put some acid in my coffee and I'm hallucinating. I have hands when I don't have hands, right? Then that would defeat my knowledge claim. And so sort of a standard view in epistemology is that sort of knowledge is defeasible, sort of you're prima facie entitled to say that you know or justifiably believe something, unless or until somebody has sort of burden shifting evidence to undercut or rebut that kind of evidence.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you.
One second, Felipe. Do you want to go to some other questions, or do you want to continue with this person?
I think in the interest of time, we go to other ones. But yeah, if you want to send me, if the person talking before wanted to send me something, I'd be glad to pursue it further. But I think in the interest of time, what time is it? Over here it's 2:10. Yeah, we should probably go on.
Yeah, we'll go through two more questions and then we'll go to the promotional part. Um, So Alex asks again, what are your thoughts on Graham-Appy's favorite theory of modality, where possible worlds all have to share some initial history? And what is your favorite theory of modality?
It's interesting you bring that up. It's currently something that I'm thinking about off and on. It's kind of, I mean, I find it intriguing and prima facie plausible. I don't have any settled views of the matter of Mackey's view here, but I think it's at least prima facie plausible. It's pretty it's very similar to Alistair Wilson's Everettian account of modality that, on Everettian interpretations of quantum mechanics, there's these many branching worlds. We could say they all branch from the singularity or something like that if there was a Big Bang singularity, suppose. And then all these worlds are grounded in that initial state and just quantum decoherence of the different branches of the wave function. So I think, I think it's plausible and pretty cool. The one thing I wonder about is, I think that it was the initial state, initial natural state necessary. I'm inclined to say, yeah. I've said things in print about this before. I've said, well, I'm tempted to say, if you put my feet to the fire, I'd say, yeah, it's probably, matter energy or whatever matter energy is made out of. Who knows, the wave function and configuration space or whatever is metaphysically necessary. There's a paper that just came out yesterday in Philosopher's Imprint where a guy defends this sort of a view that there's a scientific case to be made that the physical universe is metaphysically necessary, or whatever it's made out of. And then from there, you can get, from that initial state, you get all the rest of the modal facts. He also says it could be brutally contingent or something. I would say probably factually necessary, factually metaphysically necessary. I've defended that possibility in print. But yeah, I think it's a very plausible view. I think that's the way to go now, is to say, and I don't know why we didn't see it before, but if you think that some sort of naturalistic view of the world is viable, why not say the universe is metaphysically necessary, or whatever the universe is ultimately made out of? I think it has as much going for it as saying that God of say the God of classical theism is. I think Hume's points from the dialogue on the cosmological argument are relevant there. You could say, oh, well, it's not a priori. We don't know a priori that matter is necessary. It doesn't wear its modality on its sleeve, as it were. So we can imagine there being no universe, so it must be contingent. And, of course, Hume comes back and says, well, the same thing goes with God. God doesn't wear his modality on its sleeve. I can imagine God not existing. So by the same reasoning, shouldn't we say God's contingent? So it looks like both of them are a posteriori necessities, necessities that we would know by experience and not by, a priori intuition. And so since they're in the same metaphysical boat, in the same modal boat, I would just say, well, might as well, if you could take God as metaphysically necessary, why not take whatever the universe is made out of as metaphysically necessary? In my chapter, Causation and Sufficient Reason, in the Oppie Kotersky volume, Theism and Atheism, Opposing Arguments in Philosophy, and in the book with Josh, I gesture towards this sort of a view. I say, well, given my argument that all made things are made from or out of other things, then you couldn't get creation ex nihilo. So since there's some stuff here, some matter here, matter must have always been here, or whatever matter is ultimately made out of. And if that's true, then it looks like you can give some sort of cosmological argument for the necessary existence of the universe. It must be a necessary being, right? And so I think by what I call an Epicurean cosmological argument, you could give an argument that the universe is a metaphysically necessary being, or whatever it's made out of. Hello?
Yes. Oh, I thought you were just
sorry.
pausing there for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
My
I
bad.
think so. Oh, sorry. I was worried my AirPods died.
Oh, no, we
But
can hear you.
great. But yeah, that's so short story long. Long story short, I would say that I think I find his view very attractive, Oppie's view.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
You bet.
So, Relay Theology asks you, in William Lane Craig's review of the book Arguing About Gods, he writes, following Craig's boxing analogy. Yeah, so the question basically boils down to books like Arguing About Gods and works by the likes of Oppie have dealt, according to Craig himself, major blows to natural theology. In your opinion, what other major blows to natural theology do you think have come from atheists?
Well, first I would like to make a plug for Oppie's book.
Just quickly, and the reverse as well. Like, what major blows do you think atheists have taken from theists?
Oh, good. Very ecumenical question. Good. So yeah, first I would want to plug all of Oppie's work. It's really good, and he's made this. For many years, he's been developing a case against theism. I think his arguments are pretty compelling. A lot of them, and his criticisms. I think his argument summarized in his book, The Best Argument for God, so it summarizes this book, this argument he's been making for a long time, but it's kind of this sort of abductive argument for naturalism, and it's sort of like an argument from elimination as well. So I think that's a powerful case. I tend to think that is, and I know this sounds bad, but I tend to think that my argument for material causality, or some version of it, is also a significant problem against the possibility of a God who can create concreta ex nihilo. But I think that I don't think that we should look at these arguments as in the classical way of just looking at a bunch of deductive arguments and just analyzing them ad nauseum, ad infinitum. I think that there's value in that. But I think ultimately, and this is a plug for Graham Oppie, he's right that we got to get away from this kind of stuff because the main problem is you can always rationally resist a premise in a deductive argument for or against God, right? You could have other commitments in your comprehensive view of things that would justify you in rejecting a premise, or you could always do a G.E. Moore shift, or as they say, one person's modus ponens is another modus tollens. So I don't think this is ever going to win the day. I think that you're going to have a cumulative case, abductive inference to the best explanation about large-scale metaphysical hypotheses about ultimate reality, and you weigh them in terms of the degree to which they embody the theoretical virtues of simplicity, scope, conservatism, and so on. So I think he's right. I think he's given good arguments, and I think his methodology of inference to the best explanation is the way to go. And so each little argument, the nub of every argument, think of as a data point that any adequate large-scale hypothesis must explain. And so I don't think this or that argument is going to do it. I think it's going to be sort of clusters of considerations that are going to do it. So on the So I would recommend looking at that 100 Arguments for Atheism, which, by the way, I should say that last person who called in, they asked about, oh, you give 100 arguments for atheism and you don't know atheism is true? That's right. So the purpose of giving that 100 arguments for atheism isn't to prove atheism is true. The whole point of that was just to say, look, it's often said that there's lots of arguments for theism and only one or two for atheism, namely the problem of evil and the problem of divine fitness. And my project has been just to point out that there's lots of arguments for atheism as well. And so I think that the debate has been, I think there's just been disinformation about the sort of theism versus atheism debate. Again, but if you pan out and at least what I take to be the larger scheme of things, this classical theism versus physicalism kind of debate is kind of stale and not very productive. But the main reason I gave those arguments is to say, let's not say that there's 24 or so or more arguments for theism and one or two arguments for atheism. That's just misleading, right? And if we're trying to get at the truth, let's at least get the facts straight about that. But at the end of the day, I'm going to be agnostic about ultimate reality at this point, and just at best tentative towards some sort of view. And I defend that in the book, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? But so back to this thing about what are arguments on the other side of the ledger against theism. Well, against strict atheism, if you mean by that, it's a cluster of hypotheses. There's sort of strict physicalism. There's physicalism plus abstract objects, sort of like the late W.B. Quine took, and plenty of contemporary analytic philosophers who tend to be atheists accept as well. So there's concreta and abstracta. You could be a more liberal naturalist, like a Russellian monist, who says, in addition to abstracta and concreta, there are phenomenal states that are fundamental, or proto-phenomenal states that are fundamental. So you could look at, given this sort of broadening of hypotheses, you could look at, say, arguments. The knowledge, Frank Jackson's knowledge argument is an argument that gets a point, scores a point against sort of physicalist versions of naturalistic atheism. I think that is a good argument. I think that, and just about any philosopher of mind will tell you, we don't have a solution to the hard problem of consciousness, of how we could have phenomenal qualia, right? Phenomenal mental states that are private internal mental states. So I think that's a point in the ledger. But again, I don't think it's, that's a case against sort of narrow physicalism, so it's a case for classical theism. Point. It's more like, well, it's a point against strict physicalism. I think that sort of data can nicely fit in some sort of liberal version of naturalism. Now, maybe it'll turn out that other data will push away from any kind of naturalism towards something else. But then there's this huge, seemingly infinite variety of worldviews between strict physicalism and, say, classical theism. And so I think it's a mistake to say this is an argument against this version of atheism, therefore it's a vindicating argument for classical theism. Again, I think we should just take this sort of approach at theories of the shape of the moon to sort of natural theology. And I think you should just call it sort of worldview studies or something like that, and see which comprehensive theory explains all the relevant data the best. But yeah, I would say the knowledge argument. I think a lot of those arguments in the list of 100 arguments for atheism score some pretty strong points. I like the argument from Everettian quantum mechanics. It's kind of my favorite right now, next to my material causality argument. Of course, I do think the problem of evil scores significant points, but there's a huge variety of arguments there besides those. Does that answer the question?
Oh yeah, no, that was good.
Okay, great.
So we'll take one more via text, and then there's someone else who wants to ask via voice, and after that we'll go to promotional
Sure.
part. So the last text question, one second, let me just mute. Okay, yeah, the last text question is, what are your thoughts on the whole analytical continental divide in philosophy?
I'm probably the wrong person to add because I'm ignorant of a lot of this stuff on the continental divide. I was sort of just trained in analytic philosophy, so I'm probably, who knows, maybe I'm brainwashed. But having said that, I do think there's a lot of stuff of value that I have read on the continental side. I think we should count Kant and Husserl as on the continental side, and they have insights that I think are valuable. Some of Nietzsche's stuff I think is valuable. I haven't read a lot outside of that. What I read some Hegel in grad school, which sad to say I didn't get very far into. Hegelian, the basic idea of Hegelian synthesis, I think, is important about, at least in my experience, a lot of debates in philosophy and science and politics end up evolving into views where the best elements of opposing views are incorporated into a new view. That's my own view in philosophy of religion. Kind of my tentative hypothesis about ultimate reality is very Hegelian. Stuff like postmodernism and deconstructionism, I haven't read that stuff. I guess there are some postmodernist elements in contemporary analytic philosophy, though. I mean, there's people that say, Ray Langton's argued for a Kantian humility, like we can't know things in themselves. We can only know relational properties and dispositional properties. We can't know categorical properties. A lot of work in philosophy of physics seems to point that way. Seems like objects just decompose into dispositions and relations. Where's the intrinsic properties? I don't know. We haven't found them yet. And so maybe we don't have knowledge of things in themselves, unless the world is just a network of relations, which, the ontic structural realists take that approach. But at least those are some kinds of points that I think that analytic philosophers can agree with.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Yes, Xerxes, did you want to ask a question? Let me see if he's unmuted. Yes, Xerxes, you're unmuted now.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Hello.
How's it going?
Awesome. It's going pretty good, Felipe. Anyways, I wanted to ask you a question because you seem to focus quite a bit of attention toward the Kalam cosmological argument specifically. Is that an unfair assessment? We're both Missouriites as well, so I feel like we have a connection, an unspoken bond.
Awesome.
But anyways, a few years ago, I actually read your paper, Moreland on the Impossibility of Traversing the Infinite.
Aha.
Yes, and one of the things I've always found particular about the Kalam's second premise, the universe began to exist, is that it is defended by some perceived logical impossibility with traversing the infinite. Boils down to the infinite train track problem. Why is it the case that these sorts of problems with infinitude wouldn't apply equally to an infinite God? I don't recall you ever touching on that. That's sort of the contention in your paper.
Good question. I feel the force of that, but I kind of have stayed away from it because I don't have a worked out view about it. I just know that Craig has said the kinds of infinites that apply to God are different, sort of like qualitative infinite. instead of quantitative, but I like as intensive magnitudes instead of extensive magnitudes or something. I don't know the details of that, but I bet you. I mean, I share your suspicion that if you really dug into this, I think it is going to apply to God. Wes Morriston has alluded to worries about that, about say God's foreknowledge of the future. There's going to be, what's he say? Imagine there's two angels. We'll just I forget what he called them, but just call them A and B. And God has given them the tasks for every even numbered second. Angel A says glory, and every odd numbered second, God B says hallelujah, and they just say glory, hallelujah, right, over and over again throughout an infinite future. What is the number? How many glory hallelujahs will be said by these angels? And it seems like the only answer is an infinite number of future praises, right? And so God knows them all, right? And so it looks like he's going to have an actually infinite set of elements of foreknowledge just for these two angels. Craig has said something like, I think it was Robert Adams or maybe William Wainwright or one of those original guys in the Society of Christian Philosophers who argued that God's knowledge is non-propositional. He has a simple single intuition that we could just break up potentially infinitely, but we'll never actually infinitely divide it up. So he says there's a single simple intuition that we could break up into finite parts, but those are sort of conventional abstractions from the nature of his real knowledge. He said stuff like that. I doubt if that's really going to help at the end of the day. I think that sort of William Lane Craig, Wes Morrison style worries are going to do that. I think Alex Malpass and Wes Morrison have a new paper out with Pacific Philosophical Quarterly called Endless and Infinite, I think it just came out, where they give this sort of, hey, the future is going to be actually infinite, or it's actually infinite too. And it's not going to, Craig's point about, the future is only potentially infinite, while the past is actually infinite. I haven't read the paper, or at least not carefully. So I have a feeling that's the line they're going to take, that, that's true. The future will be actually infinite. And so there's a symmetry problem with past actual infinites and future ones. And if that's true, then, his argument's in trouble. But you could just take that future actual infinites and just bring in God's foreknowledge and say, if the future will be actually infinite, and God has exhaustive knowledge of the future, he's going to have an infinite number of propositions that he knows. And doesn't he know all these propositions about the past? How many seconds have elapsed? But of course, he denies the past is infinite. But yeah, I don't have a problem. Lately, I'm just like, what's the big deal if the universe had a beginning, right? That just means it has a first moment, not that the first moment was caused. If you have like a tenseless theory of time, like a sort of a universe is a four-dimensional block, then it has a leftward edge, so to speak. But the universe itself is a timeless block with a leftward edge, to moments. And that doesn't seem like the right relevant kind of beginning that just cries out for a cause.
It's like a ruler having like the zero.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of like you sort of spatialize time and just say, well, there's an edge to time, like there's an edge to space or something like that. Doesn't seem to cry out for explanation. And Craig has, at least in the past, said that, I think even in that Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, says his argument's not going to work if the universe is like a 4D block.
Yeah, several places.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll do the whole promotional stuff. You spoke about your blog. Is there like And you also have like a page on Phil papers and Phil people, right?
Yeah. So if you go to Phil People, I'll have a page there. If you just put in Felipe Leon, I'm the one at El Camino College. By the way, my my views are my own and don't necessarily represent the views of the school that I teach at. They're just my own views. I have an academia.edu page, and then just sort of a Google Sites page. If you put in like Felipe Leon philosophy or something, and then I have a blog, exapologist.blogspot.com. Just Exapologist. I've been doing it since 2006.
Do you have any social media?
I have a Twitter account, which is usually just I just post. Oh, I just read this in the news. So it's not really interesting. It's sort of like it's really for myself to curate news to go back and read things. But I have a Facebook page, but I kind of have that locked down because I've had it open before to whoever, and then you get people sort of trolling you and stuff like that. So I've had to not do that. But yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the AMA. Everybody's telling you thanks in the text chat, the Felipe Leon questions, and we appreciate for you taking the time to answering our questions.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a delight, and thanks to everybody for their wonderful questions. Sorry I couldn't get to them all, but it's been a lot of fun.